The cub had been screaming for 3 days when they finally sent the prod team in to kill it. I was 40 feet away with a feed sack on my shoulder when the first handler went over the crate wall in full plate, and I remember thinking, before anything else happened, that he was holding the prod wrong. You don't lead with the spark end, not with a starving animal. You might as well lead with your throat. The live deck of the Stoneward was the lowest pressurized level of the ship, a long steel cavern that had carried ore separators in its first life, and now carried whatever the evacuation of Cobbett's Reach had managed to throw. Aboard, 400 refugees on the decks above us. Down here the animals, crated saddle stock, cage birds, 2 rows of confiscated beast-yard freight under a magnate seal, and at the far end, behind a double bulkhead the crew would not walk past without touching the prayer groove in the doorframe, the thing in Pen 9. I was the only human on the ship. The Veldrani had taken me on at the embarkation field because I'd been the colony's livestock veterinarian for 11 years and because nobody else would volunteer for the live deck. Tall people, the Veldrani, gray as weathered fence posts, 4-fingered, careful, good people mostly, terrified of everything in that hold, all of them, all the time, and not entirely wrong to be. The cub was a Veska, Highland Apex stock from the ranges above my old district, slate-colored, built like somebody had started with a panther, and then armored the shoulders and chest in overlapping plates of horn. Grown. A Veska stands as tall as a man's collarbone and can take a saddle ox off its feet. This one was 11 weeks old and the size of a sheepdog, and it had not eaten since its mother bled out on the loading ramp 3 days ago, shot by the magnate's own handlers when the sirens panicked her. It screamed in pulses, a sound like sheet metal tearing, and every time it screamed, something at the far end of the deck answered with one slow strike against the bulkhead. Boom. The whole hold flinching. Pen 9, keeping count. The handler with the prod got 1 boot on the crate floor. The cub came off the back wall so fast it didn't seem to cross the space between, and then the handler was down, and his gauntlet was sliding across the deck plates in 2 pieces, and the other handlers were hauling him out by the harness while the cub stood on the spot he'd been, screaming into his face from a foot away, too weak to chase, too furious to stop. Quartermaster Brell read the order off her slate from a safe distance, the way you'd read a weather report. Apex stock, refusing feed, danger to handlers, destruction at next watch. She said it in trade tongue first and then in her own language, and the deckhands bowed their heads a little, because Veldrani do that when something is decided, even something they hate. Boom, said Pen 9. I put the feed sack down. I want to say I thought about it, weighed it, made some reasoned decision a person could defend at an inquiry. I didn't. I had put down exactly 1 healthy young animal in 11 years of practice, and I had hated it more than anything I'd ever done. And I was not going to stand holding a sack of pellet feed while they did it to a cub whose only crime was grief. Give me the watch, I said. 1 watch. It eats, the order's void. Brell looked at me the way you'd look at a chair that had spoken. Around her, the prod team stopped moving. Even the injured handler, sitting against a crate getting his arm wrapped, turned his head. The stock is under seal, Brell said. It belongs to Provost Vol. Its disposal is scheduled. Its disposal will cost the Provost a yearling apex worth more than this whole deck's freight, I said. I'm offering to save him the loss for free. Put it in writing that I asked. Then if I'm wrong, the paper bites me and not you. That's the thing nobody tells you about careful people. Paper is a door. Offer to carry the blame in writing, and most careful people will hold that door open and watch you walk through it with something close to relief. Marshal Hess came down from the upper catwalk before Brell finished deciding. The Marshal was the ship's law, old for a Veldrani, with a hide gone almost white at the jaw, and he had been watching the whole thing from above, the way he watched everything. Like a man taking inventory of future trouble, he made me thumb a waiver on his slate. The language of it was magnificent. I, Marisol Reyes, contractor, human, acknowledged that I was entering the enclosure of a Class 1 predatory animal voluntarily, against advisement, in defiance of posted ordinance, and that no member of the ship's company would be obligated to retrieve my body if retrieval posed continued risk. You've handled Veska, Hesk said. It wasn't quite a question. I've handled everything that got sick or hurt or born wrong in 200 miles of Highland for 11 years, I said. Veska included, mostly at the dart end, once or twice closer. And the closer times? Still here, I said. He looked at me a long moment, the deck humming under us, the cub screaming, gone hoarse and thin behind him. Then he stood aside. Here's what I did, and I wanted understood how little of it was brave. I took a tin of the saddle ox tallow from the feed locker and a half ration of the dried meat that was mine, my own allotment, because the processed feed was the wrong smell and everything on that deck smelled wrong to that cub, every plate and bolt of it. I climbed the crate wall slow where it could watch me come, and I sat down in the far corner on the floor of its pen, in the straw, and I did nothing. The deckhands lined the rail like a jury. Brell stood with her slate held to her chest. Somewhere above, more crew were gathering at the catwalk, because word moves through a refugee ship faster than air. The cub had backed into its corner, plated shoulders up around its ears, sides going like a bellows. Up close I could see what 3 days of refusal had done. The horn plates stood away from its ribs. Its eyes were crusted at the corners. It had screamed itself down to a rasp, and underneath the rasp, constant, automatic, was a sound I knew from every orphaned animal I'd ever sat with. A low broken churring, the call and answer sound, half of a conversation with somebody who was never going to answer it again. I warmed a strip of the dried meat between my palms, working the tallow into it, taking my time. The smell got up into the air between us. I didn't look at the cub straight on. You never do. I looked at the straw and the wall and my own hands, and I talked. Nonsense, mostly. The weather on the reach this time of year. The state of the feed market before the evacuation. What my old kennel dogs would have made of a ship like this. It doesn't matter what you say. It matters that you're a voice that isn't shouting, in a body that isn't reaching, doing something with food that has nothing to do with the animal at all. It took most of an hour for the first move, and the first move was nothing. A shift of weight, one forepaw placed ahead of the other. I kept talking. I kept warming the meat. The deck stayed so quiet I could hear the air handlers 2 levels up. 4 fingered hands gripping the rail in a row, and not one sound out of any of them. The second move was 3 steps and a stop, low head down, plates flared, and a snarl ripping up out of that little body that would have done credit to something 5 times its size. The snarl was for the audience as much as me. I didn't move. I said in the same flat voice I'd been saying everything, "That's the spirit. You tell them." 20 more minutes, 2 more approaches, 2 retreats. Then it was standing over my outstretched hand, shaking with exhaustion and fury and the bone-deep wrongness of what it was about to do, and it took the meat out of my palm. The sound from the rail was a held breath breaking, a dozen Veldrani exhaling at once. The cub ate the strip in 2 pulls and stood there, sides heaving, looking at my hand. I warmed the next piece. It took that one with less ceremony. By the 4th, it had stopped pretending it might still kill me. By the 6th, its haunches went down into the straw, and it ate sitting like a civilized creature, the churring sound shifting under the rasp into something steadier, and the great hold of the stoneward, 400 refugees and a crew of 40 and every crated animal off a dying world, was silent enough to hear it swallow. And then I noticed the other silence, the one underneath. Pen 9 had stopped striking the bulkhead. I looked down the long line of the deck, past the stacked crates in the cage rows, to the double wall at the far end. Nothing, no boom. The thing behind that wall, the thing the crew would not name, the thing that had answered every one of that cub's screams for 3 days like a tolling bell, had gone absolutely still. Listening. Brell rescinded nothing, because rescinding would have meant deciding. She entered a stay of schedule, which is the Veldrani way of putting a decision somewhere it can't bite anyone, and she appointed me interim keeper of the live deck on a contractor's chit, which paid in rations and meant, in practice, that every dangerous, dirty, unwanted job on that deck now had my name on it in advance. The deckhands watched me climb out of the pen the way you'd watch weather. Respectful, at a distance. The cub stood with its forepaws on the crate wall and yelled after me, hoarse, indignant, alive, and the yelling followed me all the way up the deck, and I will not pretend it didn't do something to my chest. The injured handler caught me at the feed locker. Tolu, the young one, his arm wrapped to the elbow, his gauntlet in 2 pieces somewhere behind us. "It took food from your hand," he said. "From your open hand. The training manuals say a Veska reads an open hand as a strike about to fall. Every manual. Hand means harm. Manuals were written by people standing outside the pen," I said. "Hungry reads different from inside." He looked at his own bandaged arm, then back at me, and I watched him file the whole event somewhere new, somewhere that didn't have a drawer for it yet. "The provost will not like it," Tolu said, quieter. "He counts that stock by the head and by the pound. He had the mother shot for delaying the manifest, and he docked the loading crew for the bullet." "Then the provost and I will have a great deal to talk about," I said, and shouldered the feed sack, and went to finish my rounds, and at the end of the deck, as I passed the double bulkhead with the prayer groove worn into its frame, something on the other side of the wall turned. I heard it. A body shifting its whole weight in the dark, slow, deliberate, the way a mountain would roll over, tracking me. The sound of it raised every hair I own. I kept the same pace going past. Inside that wall, it could hear my boots and my breathing, and for all I knew, my pulse, and whatever it was learning about me, I wanted it learning that the new keeper's stride didn't change at pen 9. "Boom," it said, once. Soft, for the first time in 3 days, not a blow, a knock. Provost Ovul came down to the live deck on the 2nd day of my keepership, and he came the way money walks into a room it owns, slow, flanked already disappointed. High-caste Veldrani, robes the color of wet slate, a seal chain across his chest carrying the sigils of 4 trade houses, 3 of which, I'd learn later, existed mostly on paper. 2 private handlers behind him in better armor than the ship's own marshals wore. He stood at the cub's pen and looked at it the way I'd seen brokers look at weanlings at the autumn sales, a look that turns a living thing into a number with legs. "It eats," he said. "It eats," I agreed. The cub was working through a tallow dress strip 10 feet from us, one eye on the strangers, plates half raised. It had eaten 9 times in 2 days. It had also claimed the corner of the pen nearest my route to the feed locker and shrieked at me every time I passed without stopping, which the deckhands had begun to find theatrical. Then it travels to grill anchorage as scheduled, and it sells as scheduled. Vol's trade tong was beautiful, polished, the kind that's been used on people for a lifetime. The pit agents pay for yearling apex stock by the pound keeper. You will see it gains. You will not see it gentled. A pit animal that has learned a hand is for feeding is an animal that hesitates, and hesitation is a discount. You want it fed by thrown ration, I said. I want my freight to arrive at its weight and its temper intact, both temperaments. He looked at me for the first time, and there was nothing lazy in it. I am told you put your hand into my property's enclosure. Understand me, human. If my property takes your hand off at the wrist, I will bill the voyage for the disruption to its feeding schedule. Nothing else about the event will interest me. That's fair, I said. Cheaper than a glove, my hand. Doesn't even go on your invoice. One of the deckhands made a sound and turned it into a cough. Vol's jaw set. People like Vol are armored everywhere except against being agreed with in the wrong tone, and I'd had 11 years of practice on stockbrokers who thought a vet was a kind of servant. He turned away from me, which is what that kind of man does instead of losing, and his eye went down the deck and found the double bulkhead. "And Pen 9, he said. "It feeds?" The silence that came down the live deck then was its own kind of answer. Brell, who had materialized with her slate the way quartermasters do when an owner is aboard, said carefully, "Pen 9 has refused all feed since loading. Provost." 11 days. For one moment, something that wasn't commerce crossed Vol's face. That animal is the contract quartermaster. The cub is a courtesy. The saddle stock is ballast. The 9th is what the pit agents are crossing 40 days of dark to bid on. If it starves itself to spite us all, this voyage runs at a loss, he said the 9th like a man naming a debt. I'd heard the name from the deckhands by then, said Lowe, said with the prayer groove touch. The beast in Pen 9 was a grown male Vesca out of the high-reach waryard stock, bred up over generations for the fighting pits by the colony's beast yards, and it had killed 8 handlers in its working life, which is why nobody used its yard name anymore. They'd stopped numbering the handlers and started numbering it. The mother of my cub had been brought down off the same range in the same season. The crew said the 9th had been in the next stall when Vol's handlers shot her on the ramp and had heard the whole thing and had not made one sound until the ship sealed and had then begun with great patience to take the bulkhead apart. "Double its ration in the chute," Vol said. "If it refuses through tomorrow, run the compulsion rig and pump it. I will not deliver a famine rack to the pits and call it Apex." "The compulsion rig killed the last animal it was used on," I said. "The last animal it was used on was dying anyway. He was already walking. You keep the small stock, keeper. The 9th is handled by my people or not at all. His people ran the chute feed that night. The 9th let the double ration sit until the smell filled the whole aft deck, and then, with what I can only call deliberation, it pushed the entire trough back out through the chute flap bent double. Bent, a steel trough folded like a tortilla, posted back through the slot like a letter. Tolu brought it to me in both hands the way you'd carry evidence of a miracle, and the deckhands gathered around it, and nobody said anything because what was there to say? 11 days starving, and it had the strength to do that, and the message could not have been plainer if it had been stamped into the metal. Not from you. I started taking my breaks at the aft end of the deck after that. Not at Pen 9, nobody went to Pen 9, but at the last crate row before the double bulkhead, 30 feet out, where there was a bollard you could sit on. I'd bring my ration tin and eat there, and talk, the same way I'd talk to the cub, the same useless, wonderful nonsense. The weather on the reach, the price of saddle ox. The cub's appetite, which had gone from refusal to crime, it had eaten a glove on day 3, strap and all, and I'd had words with it. And it had yelled back at me with its whole chest, and the watching deckhands had needed a minute. And the thing behind the wall would come to the wall and lie down against it. I could hear the scale of it settling, plate against steel, a sound like a ship docking. It never made another noise while I talked. The crew noticed inside 2 days, because the crew noticed everything I did with the freight, and the strikes on the bulkhead, 11 days of clockwork, had simply stopped, except now and then soft that single knock. The deckhands began to time their work to my breaks. Maintenance that had been deferred all voyage got done in the aft section between the start of my lunch and the end of it. On the 5th day I brought a bucket. Raw cuts, off ration, bought from Brell's stores against my own chit with most of what my keepership paid, dressed with tallow, warmed at the galley till the smell of it was a hand on the back of the neck. The feed chute for Pen 9 was a steel drawer in the double wall, made so no part of a handler ever shared air with the animal. I didn't use the drawer. I crouched at the inspection slot, a slit of dark at eye height with 3 fingers of armored glass in it, and I held a cut of meat up where the dark could see it, and I said, "It's from my hand or it's from nobody, old man." Same terms as the little one got. Your call. Then I put the meat in the drawer with my bare hand, slow, so the slot could watch every inch of the arm that did it, and I shut the drawer, and I sat down on the deck right there against the wall, closer than anyone had been since loading, and ate my own lunch with my back against Pen 9. Tolu told me afterward that the watch officer logged a deck-wide stoppage of work at that point. 40 crew on shift, and not one of them breathing. For a long time, nothing. Then the dark on the other side of the glass moved. The sound of that body coming up the pen was wrong for something its size. There was too little of it. 400 pounds of war-bred apex crossing 30 feet of steel like smoke crossing a field, and then the slot went black, fully black, an eye taking up all 3 fingers of glass. Brass-colored, round as a coin, a pupil that went thin at the light. It looked at me. Through 3 fingers of armored glass and a bulkhead rated for orefall, I felt the looking the way you feel a stove from across a room. I gave it back my eating face and my flattest voice. "Tro's in the drawer," I said. "I don't do table service." The drawer thumped. The meat was gone. And from inside the wall, low so low it came up through the deck plates and into my back teeth, came a sound nobody on that ship had ever heard out of Pen 9. A sound I knew from the Highland Ranges on summer nights, the long rolling underground thunder a Vesca makes to its own pack and nothing else on earth. Up the deck, a deckhand sat down on a crate, slowly, like his knees had been paid off. Tolu had his bandaged arm pressed against his chest, and his eyes were enormous, and what he said, what got repeated up 3 decks by nightfall and came back to me wearing capital letters by morning, was, "It answered her." 11 days of silence, and it answered her open hand. That was the night the refugees started coming down to look at me. Just 1 or 2 at first, at the top of the catwalk stairs, gray faces between the railings, watching the human keeper do her rounds. The cub yelling its outrage at the end of every visit, the far wall knocking once soft when my boots passed Pen 9. Boom. "Good night to you too, old man." The cub nearly died that week anyway, and not from any order. It had eaten 1 glove already and gotten away with it, which is the worst education a young animal can receive. The 2nd glove had a buckle. I found it at the start of my watch standing in the middle of its pen, with its head low and its sides bored stiff, not screaming, and the not screaming was what put ice in me, because by then that cub commented on everything. It hadn't touched its morning feed. When I came over the wall, it didn't come to meet me. It just stood there with its plates half raised at nothing, drooling a thin rope, and when I laid my hand flat on its flank, I could feel the gut underneath as tight as a cargo strap. Impaction. I'd have bet my chit on it before I'd finished the first palpation, and the bet got surer the longer I worked. Something with corners was sitting in the pyloric bend of an 11-week-old Vesca, and the swelling around it was building by the hour, and there is no version of waiting that wins that race. Here was the arithmetic of it, and I laid it out for Brell and Hesk at the rail exactly this bluntly. The ship had no surgery for large stock, no anesthesia rated for Vesca blood, and the only veterinary text on Vesca anatomy within 40 days of dark was standing at the rail talking to them, because I'd written most of my own notes on the species across 11 years of darting and patching the wild ones that tangled with our fence lines. I could dose it with what I could improvise from the medical stores, paraffin slick and a gut relaxant scaled down from Saddleox tables by guesswork. And then I would have to work the blockage loose from the outside with my hands, for as long as it took, on a conscious apex predator in active pain. The manuals, Tolu began and stopped himself, because he already knew and said instead, quietly, "Pain breaks the truce. Every animal in the books bites the hand that treats it, even the tame ones, even your earth ones." "Yes," I said. "That's generally how it goes. And you will be inside the wall with it." "That's where the gut is, Tolu. They didn't forbid me. I've thought about that since, more than once. A week earlier, they'd have forbidden me, and a week earlier, I'd have needed forbidding, but the deck had already crossed some line in its understanding of what the human keeper was for, and what they did instead of forbidding was worse and better. They came to watch me maybe die, the whole shift lining the rail, silent, and Hesk stood at the gate of the pen itself with his boarding piece unbonded for the only time that voyage, and we both knew it wasn't for the cub, and we both knew he'd never be fast enough, and he stood there anyway, because that's what the old man's law looked like when the ordinances ran out. Vol's senior beastman came down, too, Dremic. I should set him down properly here, because he matters later. A scarred old professional, gray gone, almost blue at the jaw, hands like tree roots, working apex stock since before I was born, and he'd watched my open palm business all week from a polite distance with the expression of a master farrier watching someone shoe a horse with poetry. He didn't believe in me, he believed in chutes, rigs, and arithmetic, and he told me once, more colleagues than I'd had teachers. But he came to the rail for this, and he brought his own kit, and he set it on the rail where I could reach it. And that kit had things in it the ship's stores didn't, and that was Dremic's whole sermon. He thought I was about to lose the hand. He made sure I'd lose it near the good clamps. The dosing went easy. The cub took the slick from my palm like everything else, miserable, trusting, and that trust was about to be the whole question, because 40 minutes later, I was kneeling in the straw with both hands pressed deep into the flank of a creature whose species' answer to pain had been forged by the Highland ranges into one syllable, and the first time I bore down on the blockage, the cub made a sound I'd never heard and never want to again, and its head whipped around and its mouth, that mouth that had taken a handler's gauntlet apart in half a second, closed on my forearm and held. Plates flared, eyes white-rimmed, every wire in its body screaming bite, and the pressure on my arm stayed exactly at the line of denting the sleeve and went no deeper, and the cub stood there shaking with the effort of refusing its own blood, gripping my arm like a child gripping a rail. I know, I told it, and kept working, because stopping makes the next start worse. I know, yell all you want, we finish anyway. It took the better part of 2 hours. I narrated the whole of it in the flat voice, the weather, the feed prices, the catalog of every animal I'd ever pulled through worse, and the cub gripped and released my arm. I stopped counting how many times, never once breaking skin, gulping its awful sounds down between waves, because some ancient bookkeeping in it had ruled that the hand in the pain was not the cause of the pain, and at the far end of the deck the whole time, Pen 9 ran the low thunder without a break, the longest anyone had ever heard it, like a man pacing a waiting room. When the buckle finally shifted, the cub's whole gut unclenched under my palms like a fist letting go, and the animal folded down into the straw and put its head in my lap and went out like a lamp, asleep before its chin landed, and I sat there in the wreck of my own nerves with 2 hours of tremor arriving all at once, and the deck made no sound at all. Then Drent climbed down from the rail, old as he was, and came over the wall, the only other soul aboard who had ever entered that pen by choice, and he knelt across from me, and he picked up my forearm in his tree-root hands and examined the sleeve, the dented, unbroken weave of it, for a long time like a man reading scripture in a language he'd been told was dead. 30 years, he said finally. 30 years, and every text and every scar agrees. Pain breaks the truce. It bit you 40 times and held the bite 40 times. He laid the arm back down on my knee with strange care, the way you'd set down an instrument you'd misjudged. What did you give it, human? What's in the open hand that I never had? I was too tired for philosophy, so what he got was the truth at its plainest, and Tolu, who missed nothing, put it on his slate, and it found its way later into the doctrine, third clause from the end. Nothing's in the hand, I said. That's the whole trick, Dremic. It checked. The first day, when it was starving, there was nothing in the hand but the food every time. After enough times, the hand is the proof. Pain can't break a truce. Pain just asks it very loudly whether it was ever real. The old beast man looked down at the cub asleep in my lap, and over at the double bulkhead where the thunder had finally settled into silence, and I watched 30 years of chutes and rigs and arithmetic come quietly off their mountings. Ours were real, he said, mostly to himself, going back over the wall. Every animal I ever rigged, the truce was offered and we built chutes instead. 30 years of asking the wrong species to be brave. Vol moved to have me removed 2 days after the impaction, and he did it the way his kind always fights, on paper, from above, without once coming down the ladder. A formal motion to the shipmaster's desk. Termination of the contractor's keepership for cause. The cause ran to 11 items, and Brell, who was procedurally obligated to read them to me, did so at the feed locker in a voice that got flatter with each one, which I had learned was the Veldrani equivalent of reading them through her teeth. Unauthorized entry into sealed freight enclosures, 4 counts. Unauthorized veterinary intervention on bonded stock, 1 count. Never mind that the intervention was the only reason the bonded stock still had a pulse. Expenditure of personal rations on freight, irregular. Fostering of dependency behaviors degrading to market temperament, ongoing. Unauthorized naming of freight, and I wanted in the record that the man billed me for the name. Item 9, assess the commercial damage of the designation soot against the projected pit value of an unnamed animal. Because a named thing, his filing argued, with citations becomes a kept thing, and kept things fight wrong. They hesitate, his expert tech said, to leave their handler unprotected. He'd flag that as a defect. I've kept a copy of the filing all these years because no one ever believes item 9 until I show them. The animal might protect its handler. Defect. Discount accordingly. He is within his rights, Brell said when she'd finished. The stock is his, the keepership is the ship's. He cannot order you off the ship's deck, but he can order his freight handled only by his own crew, and his motion asks the shipmaster to so order. She lowered the slate, and her inner lids came down, and she added in the same procedural monotone, "The motion is scheduled for the shipmaster's desk at first watch tomorrow. Responses from affected departments are permitted by ordinance." I have never once seen a department respond. It is a formality. Then she walked away, leaving the word formality sitting on the feed locker like a key she'd forgotten on purpose. I didn't write a response. I'll be honest about why. I was tired. My arm wore a bracelet of cub-shaped bruises under the sleeve, and I'd spent 11 years on a colony, learning that when an owner wants you off his stock, you finish the course of treatment, hand over your notes, and go, because the law is the law and the animals can't read it, and breaking your heart against a deed never fed anyone. I planned to spend my last keeper's watch teaching Tolu the feed schedule. The deck had other ideas, and I knew nothing about any of it until it was done. Departments responded, all of them. The live deck crew filed first, every name on the shift roster, a response in Tolu's careful capitals stating that handler injuries on the deck stood at 0 since the human keeper's appointment, against 4 in the 11 days prior, and that the undersigned would accept reassignment to waste reclamation in a body before they would run provost vols, shoot and prod handling on stock that had learned the open hand on the grounds, and this was the sentence that got quoted up and down the ship, that you cannot teach an animal the hand never lies, and then let a ledger make a liar of every hand on the deck. The medics filed, citing the handler's arm healed clean ahead of every projection, and the unprecedented forearm of the keeper, submitted as evidence under the heading voluntary bite inhibition, conscious apex juvenile, sustained, with photographs of the bruising my sleeve had hidden from everyone but the examining medic 40 distinct grip marks, not one breaking skin, annotated in clinical trade tongue that read, even in translation, like a man trying to keep his hands from shaking while he wrote. The watch officers filed on noise discipline, of all things attaching decibel logs, pen 9 before and after, with the after a flat calm line interrupted only by single soft knocks at intervals, which, the filing noted dryly, corresponded to the keeper's logged rounds with a precision the ship's own chronometers would envy, and Dremick filed. Vol's own senior beastman, 30 years on the man's stock, submitted one paragraph over his own seal, and the paragraph said that in his professional judgment the freight in question was no longer handleable by compulsion methods at any acceptable casualty rate, that the sole functioning handling system aboard was the human keeper's, and that if the provost terminated it, the provost should be advised that his senior handler's resignation would be attached to the same order, effective the same watch, signed, Dremick, who had buried more colleagues than the keeper had had teachers, and intended to stop. The shipmaster's ruling came down by mid-watch, and it was 4 words long, which Veldrani consider the height of judicial style. Motion denied. Handling unchanged. I learned all of it at once, the motion, the filings, the ruling, when Tolu read the whole docket aloud at the feed locker to the assembled shift like a man reading mail from home, and I had to spend some time with my back to them rearranging feed sacks that did not need rearranging. The cub leaned on my legs the whole while, 90% recovered and 100% convinced its leaning was load-bearing. And from the aft end, the wall knocked once, soft, on no schedule at all, as if something down there had followed the reading too and wished to register its position on the record. Vul never mentioned the motion again, not once, which in a man like that is the sound of a wound. But he came down that evening and stood at the rail a long time, robes perfect, face shut, watching me run the last feet of the watch, the open palm, the flat voice, the cub sitting at my hip like a piece of weather that had decided to be local to me forever. And when he turned to go, he said, not loudly, not to anyone in particular, the thing that told me exactly what he was and exactly what was coming. Every hand on this ship answers to a ledger somewhere, keeper, even yours. The only question commerce ever asks is who is holding the pen when the page turns. I went back to the feed run. There's no profit in trading proverbs with a broker. But I'll allow that the man could read a page before it turned better than I did because I took it for a threat about contracts. And it wasn't. It was a threat about the kind of day when ledgers and lives get weighed on the same scale, and he already knew, days before the rest of us, that such a day was loose in the dark out there, pacing us, gaining by inches. The boy got down to the live deck during the umbilical maintenance window when the lighting ran to quarter power for a half watch, and the catwalk gates ran on stored charge, which is a polite way of saying they ran on hope. 6 years old, maybe 7, a refugee child off the reach like the rest of us. And he'd been at the catwalk rail every day for a week. I learned afterward, watching the human keeper do her rounds, the way all of them watched. His mother thought he was at the ration line. The ration line thought he was with his mother. Ships are honest about their gaps to anything small enough to use them. The deck found him the way the deck found everything, all at once and too late. A deckhand came around the crate row with a lamp and stopped as if he'd hit wire, and the lamp beam was on the far aft end, past the bollard, at the double bulkhead of Pen 9, where a child was standing on tiptoe at the inspection slot with his small flat palm pressed against the armored glass, whispering to the dark on the other side. I want to be exact about the next part, because the all-ship inquiry was exact about it and the crew still tells it loose. Nobody screamed. That was the mercy of it. Veldrani panic goes silent before it goes loud, and the deckhand had the sense to freeze in the silent stage, and so did the three others who came up behind him, because every text they'd ever read said that what happens next to a small warm shape at the gate of a feeding refusal apex is not something you can outrun, and the slot was open. Not the slot. The inner shutter of the inspection slit stood retracted on its track, which it should not have done for a child's hands, which it had never once done for the maintenance crew, without 2 keys and a prayer. And behind the glass, filling the whole 3 fingers of it, was the eye, brass coin, thin pupil, a hand's width from the boy's face, and the boy was talking to it. That carried in the quarter-power hush, his little voice running on, confiding, unhurried in the up-and-down sing-song of a child saying important things to a large animal. And what he was saying, the deckhand told the inquiry, was the feed prices, the weather on the reach, the state of his family's old saddle ox, sold at the embarkation field. The boy had been at the rail for a week, you understand. He had learned the doctrine the way children learn everything, whole by watching, long before Tolu ever set it down in capitals, and the doctrine as he'd absorbed it was, you stand at the wall where the Great One lives, and you put your hand flat and you tell it the ordinary things, and that is how it knows you're its own. I came down the deck slow, no lamp, talking before I was halfway, the same flat voice, the same nothing, so that the wall would have both of us in its ears at once. The eye flicked to me and back to the boy. The pupil was wide and soft in the low light. I got within 10 feet and stopped, because closer was a variable nobody needed, and I said, that's Master Piran then. I heard there was a stockman's son on the passenger decks. My father kept the 3rd herd on the reach, the boy said to me, to the eye, to the general assembly of the dark. His palm never left the glass. The big one is sad, he's been listening to me. He likes the part about the ox. He would, I said. He's an ox man from way back. Tell him the ox got a good price, and then we'll go up and tell your mother where you've been, because she's about to take the catwalk gate off its hinges. Will he be all right alone? The eye in the slot did not blink. The whole deck, 4 deckhands, the gathering shadow of the crew at the rail, the cub stretching its neck over its crate wall to see, waited on the wall, and the wall's answer came up through the deck plates. The long thunder, 2 seconds of it, soft as a kettle 2 rooms away, and the shutter of the inspection slot slid home along its track, gentle as a drawer of cutlery, closed by something on the other side that had decided the visit was over and the visitor should be returned, undamaged, with a receipt. I walked Master Piran the length of the live deck with his hand in mine, and he waved at the cub, and the cub yelled at him, which delighted everyone of his opinion. And at the catwalk stairs his mother arrived and the state mothers arrive in, and the boy was confiscated, lectured, wept over, and borne away, lecturing her in his turn about the ox the whole way up, and Marshal Hesk stood at the bottom of the stairs through all of it with his thumb in his belt, watching the inspection slot, the closed shutter, me. 2 keys, he said. 2 keys and a maintenance code open that shutter, keeper. It was logged shut at the start of the watch. Then your logs learned what the manuals haven't, I said. Doors are a matter of opinion to him. They always were. He's been on the polite side of his opinion since loading, and I'd let the inquiry write that down in those words. The inquiry wrote down stricter words and welded the shutter's track, for all the good anyone believed that would do, and posted a standing order, miners prohibited below the hold line, which lasted exactly 4 days before it collided with the fact of where the miners kept being found. Because Piran came back, lawful, with his mother and a martial escort, the very next ration day, to finish telling the wall about the ox. And 2 more children were at the rail behind him, and then 9. The passenger decks were a long steel grief, you have to understand. 400 people stacked in bunks with their whole world reduced to what their arms had carried, and somewhere below them was a deck where nothing was afraid, and the children found it like water finding a low place. So we made it lawful. Hesk and I, because the alternative to lawful was secret, and secret gets children eaten. Supervised ranks along the crate rows, ration day visits, the open palm taught with grain fowl before anyone graduated to so much as the saddle stock, and a hard line painted on the deck 30 feet from Pen 9 that no small boot crossed ever, though every visit ended the same way, with the children turned to the double bulkhead and chorusing the ordinary things at the wall, the feed prices, the weather, and the wall, every time, knocking once. It was for the children that I started drilling the cub. I'll have that plain in the record too. Down and stay and the recall. The real commands under the nonsense, drilled cold, every watch, until they sat in the animal deeper than its own weather, because a deck with children on its rota cannot run on charm. The cub minded the drills like it minded everything, with operatic complaint and total compliance, and I remember thinking, as it held a downstay with the pilot sitting on its head in Piran's class, filing past it ranks, that I was building the discipline for some small, dull future emergency, a drop crate, a panicked ox. You build the thing because the day might come. Then the day comes, and it is never the day you built for, and you find out what your drills are worth in a currency you never wanted to spend. The cub broke out of its pen midway through the voyage's third week, and the ship's alarm system handled it about as well as you'd expect. I woke to a Class 1 containment siren, a corridor full of crew and emergency plate, and a Veldrani voice on the all-ship repeating that a predatory animal was loose on the accommodation decks, and all personnel were to shelter and seal. I found the predatory animal in my bunk. It had tracked me up 3 levels and through 2 pressure doors that were supposed to be crew-keyed, which to this day I cannot fully explain, except that ships are honest about their gaps to anything that hunts by them, and it had arranged itself on my pillow with its plated back against the cold wall and its head on my spare coat. And when the recovery team finally breached my cabin door in assault formation, prods up, what they found was the Class 1 containment emergency lying on its keeper's bed with its feet in the air, asleep, while the keeper stood in the doorway in her sleep shirt asking, with some heat, who exactly had taught the entire boarding watch to point spark prods at a sleeping infant. Marshal Hesk stood that team down himself. He came up the corridor, looked through my hatch a long moment, and the sound he made then was the first Veldrani laugh I'd heard since Cobbet's reach fell, a dry clicking from the bottom of the throat like dice shaken in a cup. Log the containment breach, he told the watch officer. Note the animal self-recovered to the location of its handler. Note the handler was not consulted. It cannot stay on the accommodation decks, Brell said when the paperwork found me, as it always did, by mid-watch. Ordinance forbids unsecured predatory stock above the hold line. Then secure it, I said. It's going to keep doing this, quartermaster. It's pack-bonded. You can spend the voyage rebuilding a pen it'll keep beating, or you can write the order so the rules walk behind the facts. That's most of what ordnance is for. She wrote it the Veldrani way. The cub was reclassified from freight to auxiliary keeper's equipment, which meant it could lawfully be wherever I was, the way a tool can. The deckhands found this magnificent. From that watch on, the manifest of the Stoneward carried in Brell's immaculate hand 1 entry reading equipment, keepers, live 1, and the equipment followed me on rounds with its head at my hip and screamed at the recycler fans and stole gloves and slept on my pillow and grew. You could watch it grow. The horn plates lost their starveling rattle and lay down flat and tight, and the sheepdog became a wolfhound, and the wolfhound started putting on shoulder. I named it Soot for the color and because a small plain name is a kindness to a dangerous animal. Everyone in this story had grander names than mine. The deckhands called it the Keeper's Shadow, and then just the Shadow, and stood very still when it passed and lived. Tolu started the doctrine business, and I wanted on the record that I had nothing to do with it. He'd taken to watching me feed, arm-long-heeled, taking notes on his slate like a student, and what he was writing, it turned out, was procedure. The open hand presented before the food every time, the same height, the same flat voice. The keeper eats within sight of the stock every shift, so the stock learns mealtime is shared and not contested. The keeper never reaches over the head from behind. The keeper says the same words at the same moments, and the words are nothing, and the nothing is the point, because a calm voice carrying no command is the sound of someone who isn't afraid of you and doesn't need you afraid. He wrote it all up, formatted like a ship's standing order, and he titled it, in trade tongue capitals, the Open Palm Doctrine, and he posted it at the feed locker, and within 3 days the entire live deck crew was doing it. Solemnly, to the saddle stock, to the cage birds. I came down one morning to find a 16-year-old Veldrani deckhand, presenting her open 4-fingered hand to a crate of grain fowl with liturgical seriousness while 2 of her shift mates observed and corrected her form, and I had to go around the corner and stand quietly by the recycler for a while. But here's the thing I'd ask anyone to sit with. It worked. Of course it worked. It wasn't magic, it was stockmanship, the kind every herding culture on Earth worked out 10,000 years ago, and the Veldrani had simply never built it, because the Veldrani had never domesticated a predator, not once, in their whole history. Every animal in their tradition was prey stock or pest. The concept of standing inside the reach of a thing that could kill you calmly on purpose, until it decided you were its own, did not exist in their language, and so they had assumed it did not exist at all. They'd been buying their war beasts from yards like the ones on Cobbett's Reach, handling them with chutes and rigs and prods, selling them to pits, and calling the whole arrangement natural law. And then a middle-aged human woman sat down in the straw, and the law changed shape, and they did what honest people do when the law changes shape in front of them. They took notes. Vol's people ran the compulsion rig on the 9th that same week, against my word, on the owner's standing order, while I was up on the accommodation decks worming the refugees' smuggled lap pets. The rig was a hydraulic restraint chute built into Pen 9's service wall, made to pin an animal for the pump feed. I heard the alarm from 2 decks up. By the time I got down the ladder, the aft section was sealed. There was a handler's blood on the deck plates outside the service hatch, and Vol's senior beastman, a scarred professional called Dremic, who'd been working Apex stock since before I was born, was trapped flat in the service gap between the inner and outer walls, with his leg broken in the rig's own wreckage, 6 feet from a war Vesca that had just peeled the restraint chute off its mountings like bark off a log. The 9th wasn't raging. That was the thing that had the whole deck cold. It stood over the wrecked chute with one forepaw the size of a dinner platter resting on the bent hydraulics, and it looked at Dremic through the gap. And it waited. Vesca are ambush hunters. The patience is the threat. Every minute it didn't kill him was a sentence it was letting him read in full. They would not let me open the service hatch, so I went to the inspection slot and I put my palm flat on the armored glass and I used the voice, not a command voice. I want this understood, because the training manuals the Veldrani wrote afterward kept trying to make it a command, and it was never a command. You cannot command a thing like that. You can only be very audibly someone it has decided to keep. Hey, old man. The eye came up to the slot. Brass coin, thin pupil, and behind it 400 pounds of patience with a man's life under its paw. Easy now. He's not worth the cleanup. Come to the wall and growl about it. Tell me everything he did. And before 40 witnesses and the gods of every world represented aboard, the 9th took its paw off the wreckage and came to the wall and lay down against it with a thud that shook dust off the catwalk and growled. Long, rolling, conversational, furious. A list of grievances. I sat on the deck with my back against the bulkhead and my palm on the glass and let it file the whole complaint. And 20 feet away through the service hatch, the rescue team pulled Dremic out of the gap, white-eyed, silent, alive. Vol billed the voyage for the chute. That's not a figure of speech. A formal claim posted to the ship's ledger for damage to proprietary feeding equipment, with a writer noting that unauthorized vocal interference with his stock had created a dependency on uncontracted personnel and reserving his right to seek remedy. Hesk read it aloud to me at the marshal's desk in a voice with no expression in it whatsoever, which I'd learned by then was how he handled things too stupid to survive being said in a normal tone. He's building a paper case, Hesk said. Your interference, his losses. If the 9th delivers underweight or off temper, he means the difference to land on you. And Keeper, hear me on this one thing. He set the slate down. The man shot a nursing dam on a loading ramp to save an hour, in front of her own cub, in front of the male she ranged with, and he has not once in this voyage said a word about either animal that wasn't a number. Whatever that is, it doesn't stop being that when we make port. I know what it is, I said. We had them on Earth too. We mostly stopped selling them animals. Hesk's jaw worked. And what did your people do with them instead? Gave them ledgers, I said, and kept the dogs. That night soot wouldn't settle. It stood at my cabin hatch with its plates half raised, churring at the corridor, at nothing, at the long steel dark of the ship, and far below us, for the first time since the trough came back folded, I heard Pen 9 strike the bulkhead. 3 times, slow. Not at me, I'd learn. At what the ship's long-range scope had picked up that watch, before any siren sounded, before the bridge itself quite believed it. A shadow on our wake, matching course, matching speed, gaining by inches across the dark between systems. The animals knew before the instruments did is what I'm telling you. The All-Shipmaster Vane confirmed the contact on the All-Ship the next morning in the dry administrative tone Veldrani used for disasters, the same tone Brel had used for the destruction order, and I'd learned to hear the fear underneath it by then, the way you hear weather in a horse's ear. An unregistered vessel had been holding in our wake for 2 watches. Configuration consistent with a Skither corsair. Distance closing. All hands to drill schedules. All passengers to familiarize themselves with shelter stations. Skither. I'd never seen one, but I'd buried colonists who had. They worked the margins of the evacuation routes the way wolves work a drive of cattle, which is an insult to wolves, who at least eat what they pull down. Skither corsairs hit refugee ships because refugee ships were slow, packed, underinsured, and carrying everything 400 families had managed to save, distilled down to the small, heavy valuables you grab when your world is on fire. They boarded, they stripped, they took anyone worth a ransom and anything worth a market. And the ships they left behind arrived at port carrying their cargo of empty hands and closed faces. And everyone at the relief stations knew the look, and there was a word for it in the camps that I won't write down. The stoneward could not outrun them. Everyone aboard did that math in the first hour. We were an ore-frame conversion with 400 souls aboard, and a fighting complement of generously a dozen marshals with boarding pieces. The corsair had us by 20 days of acceleration and didn't care who knew it. That's the cruelty of distances out there. We could see them coming for 9 days. 9 days watching the range tick down, drilling shelter drills, eating in shifts, pretending at routine while the shadow grew a pixel at a time on the wake display. I'll tell you what 9 days of that does to a hold full of animals. Nothing good. Animals don't read range displays, they read their people. And 400 terrified people leak fear into a ship's air like a gas. The saddle stock went off feed, the cage birds plucked themselves raw. Soot, 70 pounds now and putting on a pound a day, stopped sleeping at my feet and started sleeping across my hatch, facing out, and woke at every change of the air handlers with its plates up. And the ninth went quiet in a new way. Not the listening quiet, a working quiet. The crew heard it moving in there at all hours, slow, methodical, back and forth, and the sounds it made now weren't strikes, they were tests. A push here, a long claw drawn down a seam there, reading the metal. Brell's slate said Pen 9's bulkhead was rated for orefall, and the rating was probably even true. And every soul on the live deck understood by the third day that the only thing actually holding that wall was the animals' decision so far not to be on the other side of it. Vol made his first mistake on the fourth day. He came down with both handlers and a foreman's air and announced that, given the security situation, his freight would be consolidated for protection, and the protection he had in mind was the ninth in a transport rig, drugged, masked, and moved to the armored cargo bay amidships where the high-value goods were being gathered. Where, not incidentally, a corsair boarding party would find it crated and helpless, one more lot on the manifest, easiest thing in the world to trade away whole. You'll never get the rig on it, I said. Dremick rigged war stock for 30 years. Dremick's in a leg frame, Provost, because your rig already met your stock once. The deck hands had stopped working again. I'd learned to feel an audience gathering at my back the way you feel sun come out. You can't dart it. The dose that drops a Vesca that size in under 10 minutes stops its heart one time in 4, and for 10 minutes you'd be sharing a sealed deck with the angriest thing either of our species ever bred. The pit agents won't bid a copper on it dead. There is no version of this where you get what you want, so the question is just how expensive you'd like the lesson. His inner lids came down. That flat membrane blinked that high-cast Veldrani do instead of shouting, "Then what, Keeper, is your professional counsel?" Silk, that voice. "Since my property answers only to you." A fact I have logged, by the way, in some detail. Leave it where it is. That bulkhead's the best armor on this ship, and what's behind it is the only thing aboard that a skither boarding party should be more afraid of than we are of them. It is freight, Vol said, each word placed like a coin on a counter. It is not a deterrent, it is not a shipmate, it is not, whatever this crew's slates have begun saying, anyone's old man. It is 40,000 measures of pit stock, and the moment it stops being that, it is meat. Everything on this deck is meat, Keeper, the instant the manifest says so, even the entries that walk upright. He let that one sit in the silence so we could all count its teeth. Then he swept up the deck with his handlers, and as he passed Pen 9's double wall, the ninth hit the bulkhead from the inside, once beside his head, hard enough to ring the deck plates under all our feet, and Provost Merton Vol, 4 trade houses across his chest, went sideways into a crate stack like a man dodging traffic. In front of 40 crew. Nobody laughed. Veldrani don't much. But the silence had a shine on it, and Tolu wrote something on his slate with great care, and I'd bet my pension on what column it went in. The Pilex moved in with us that same week since the record should be complete. A Pilex is a scavenger off the reach, 6-legged, whiskered, the size of a barn cat and built like a furred horseshoe crab, and this one had been living loose in the bilge spaces since loading, raiding the feed locker like a sapper. Soot cornered it behind the recycler on a Tuesday, and I arrived expecting carnage, and found instead a standoff that had already collapsed into something more embarrassing, the Pilex flat on its back, presenting its underside in total surrender, Soot standing over it wearing the helpless expression of a young predator who has just discovered that surrender breaks all its programming. By Thursday, the Pilex was sleeping in the warm spot between Soot's shoulder plates and riding it around the deck like baggage, and the crew had named it Toll Keeper because it sat at the feed locker door at every mealtime and shook down all comers. I let it stand. A keeper learns which battles are lost before they're declared, and besides, the refugees had started coming down the catwalk stairs in real numbers by then to see them. Mothers with children on their hips, old gray men in their camp blankets, lining the rail above the live deck in the worst week of their lives to watch a human woman do her rounds with, an armored cub at her hip, and a fat scavenger riding the cub, and you'd hear it move along the rail in their low voices, the same handful of words, and Tolu translated them for me once when I asked. She isn't afraid. Look, the little one walks behind her. Nothing here is afraid of her, and she is afraid of nothing. And the great one knocks the wall when she walks past, like a sentry being relieved. The knock had become a thing the whole ship listened for by then. Boots at pen 9, boom, soft, once, every round, every watch. On the 8th night, with the corsair close enough that the wake display gave it a shape, Hesk found me at the aft bollard on my break, with my tin and my 2 animals and my back against the wall of pen 9, and the long underground thunder coming through the plates behind me, steady as a generator, because the 9th had taken to running that sound for the whole length of my breaks, and I will let everyone else tell themselves it wasn't for the company. They'll board at the cargo lock amidships, Hesk said, without preamble. He sat down on the bollard like a man whose knees kept their own ledger. They always do. They'll want the holds opened, the manifests surrendered, the passengers corralled at their shelter stations for inventory. Ransom inventory, his jaw worked. My 12 marshals can make a corridor expensive. We cannot make the ship expensive. You understand what I am saying to you. You're saying you can't win. I am saying, Hesk said, that I have read every account of every skither boarding on this route for 9 years. And the boardings that go worst are the ones where they find something that frightens them, late, by surprise, after they've decided the ship is tame. His old white jaw turned, and he looked at the double bulkhead we were leaning on, and the thunder ran on behind the steel, patient as the dark outside. And I am asking the keeper of the live deck off the record with the door of my conscience standing open. If the worst hour comes, what do you need from me and what does it cost? The thunder ran. Soot's head came up off my knee, and 70 pounds of cub looked at the old marshal with brass coin eyes, both of us listening to the wall. A master key to the live deck, I said, and nobody between me and the aft end, no matter what they hear. That's the whole list. And the cost? Whoever's standing closest to me when the wall opens, I said, had better be somebody I like. The corsair matched velocity on the 9th day at the start of 3rd watch, and the hail came through on the open band so the whole ship could hear it, which was the point. Skither don't encrypt their ultimatums. The fear is the cargo they travel on. The voice was a translator-flattened rasp, and it called itself Resk of the Hollow Tooth, and it gave us the standard terms, which Hesk had recited to me in advance almost word for word, because there is nothing creative about cruelty at scale. It runs on procedure like everything else. The stoneward would cut acceleration. The cargo locks would be opened. The ship's company would assemble at shelter stations with manifests ready. Compliance would be measured in lives spared. Resistance would be measured in lives spent, beginning with the smallest, and I'm not going to write the rest of it. There are sentences that don't deserve to be carried any further than they've already gone. Shipmaster Vane cut the engines. 400 people felt the deck go quiet under them, and somewhere above me on the catwalks, a child asked one question in a high voice and was hushed. What happened in the next hour I had no eyes on, and learned afterward from Hesk and from the inquiry record, so I'll set it down plain. Provost Vull went to the bridge with his seal chain and his 2 handlers, and he invoked cargo right, an owner's lawful privilege to negotiate independently for the protection of registered freight, and he opened a private channel to the Hollow Tooth, and he made a deal. His sealed cargo bays to be exempted from the stripping, his person, his handlers, and his freight to be passaged unmolested to Greel anchorage. In exchange, he would deliver the location and door codes of the ship's strongroom, the true ration stores, and because Skither pay premiums for novelties and Vull was nothing if not a man who knew his buyers, 1 item of exotic livestock, to wit the only human on the ship's books, a trained beastkeeper sellable, his channel transcript said, as a pit-side curiosity to the same agents who buy the war stock. The transcript used the word throwing in, as in, I'm throwing in the human. Cargo right is real law, the kind that gets written by men like Vull for days like this one. Veen could not lawfully cut the channel. What the shipmaster could do, and did, with a Veldrani's whole genius for procedure, was log the channel as it ran, complete timestamped, and route a live copy to the marshal's desk, where Hesk sat reading my sale price in real time with his jaw set like a fence post. I knew none of this. I was on the live deck doing the only useful thing left, which was walking the rows with Soot at my hip, settling what could be settled, because animals meet a crisis better if their person's hands have work in them. I had the master key on a lanyard around my neck. I'd had it since the previous midnight, When Hesk had pressed it into my palm without one word of ceremony and gone back up the ladder like a man who'd just paid a debt his rank couldn't acknowledge. The hollow tooth came alongside with a sound I will hear for the rest of my life, a long grinding kiss down the hull as their boarding collar found our cargo lock and bit. The deck lights flickered when their umbilicals took hold. Soot's plates came up full, the first time I'd ever seen the full thread array on a cub, every horn plate standing off the body like a pine cone opening. And from the aft end of the deck came the sound of the ninth rising to its feet all at once, no testing in it now, and putting its shoulder against the inner wall and holding it there, leaning, waiting on the latch of the world. Not yet, I said to both of them to my own hands. Easy now, not yet. They came through the cargo lock and vacuum rigs, lean and hook-faced, moving in a practiced fan with weapons I didn't have names for, and the first thing they did, the very first order of business, was demonstrate. A marshal at the lock had his boarding piece slung, peace-bonded, exactly per the compliance terms, and the skither point man shot him through the shoulder anyway, deliberately, almost gently, just to put the sound of it into the air of the ship. Procedure. The fear is the cargo. They corralled the passengers at the shelter stations, deck by deck, each standing in rows with their hands open while skither inventory men walked the lines, pulling rings off fingers and lockets off necks into sacks, and the marshals stood with their teeth shut and their weapons bonded because every account of every boarding said the arithmetic of resistance came due in children. Hesk stood at the head of his 12 and watched the strong room open with Vol's codes, first try, no drilling, and understood in that moment exactly what had been sold and by whom, and kept his jaw shut and waited, because old lawmen know how to wait with a thing until the hour it can be spent. They came for me at mid-watch, 4 of them, with a 5th carrying shacklestock size for livestock and Vol's senior handler walking ahead of them as a guide, not meeting anybody's eyes, and they came down the catwalk stairs into my deck, into the long steel cavern with its rows of crated lives, and the animals began to scream, all of them. Saddlestock bellowing, cagebird shrieking, the pilot up on Soot's shoulders with its whiskers flat, and under it all, through it all, from behind the double bulkhead at the aft end, a sound that was not a knock. I'd sent Soot back. I want that understood. When the boots hit the stairs, I gave the cub the down command, and the stay, the real ones, the ones we drilled, and 70 pounds of bristling warstock cub looked me in the face, and weighed 11 weeks of trust against 100,000 years of pack law, and pack law won the way it was always going to. It didn't disobey loudly. It just flowed off the bedding straw and into the shadow of the crate rows, and was gone parallel to me, low, plates flat so they wouldn't catch the light, an ambush hunter's child doing the thing it was bred for, and there was nothing I could do about it short of giving its position away. And the skither were already on my deck. Resk of the Hollow Tooth came down to see the curiosity personally. I'll give the creature this much. It had presence, a head taller than its own boarding party, vacuum rig scarred like a chopping block, and it looked at me the way Vol had looked at the cub on the second day, the broker look, the look that turns you into a number with legs. The beast tamer, it rasped through its box. The seller says the warstock answers your voice. The pits pay triple for a matched lot, stock and handler. It turned the shackle stock over in its claws, unhurried, and its mouth parts moved in what I chose not to understand as a smile. Call your animal to the rig, tamer, the big one behind the wall. Call it sweet, and it travels fed, and so do you. And there it was. The whole rotten arrangement, laid out plain in a slaver's invoice. They didn't just want me as a novelty. Vol had sold them the trick of me, the doctrine, the open palm, 11 days of trust laid down in the straw of that deck as a handling tool, a means of crating the ninth without losing men. Mercy repackaged as equipment, with a triple margin at the far end and a fighting pit under all of it. I'll need to be at the wall, I said. It comes to my voice, not to a speaker. And your men stand back from me while I work, all of them, or it reads them as a threat and you lose your lot. Behind the aft bulkhead, the sound that was not a knock ran on, the deck plates carrying it up through everyone's boots, and I watched the skither feel it, the way you feel standing water start to move. Resk's inventory men looked at the double wall, and at the prayer groove worn into its frame by 4-fingered hands, and the fan of them widened by a step without any order being given. Work then, Resk said, and gestured me aft with the shackle stock, almost courteously, the way you'd usher a tool toward its job. So I walked the length of my deck one more time, past the crate rows where a cub flowed from shadow to shadow keeping pace with me, past the bollard where I'd eaten 30 lunches against that wall, with a slaver's boarding party at my back and a master key lying against my breastbone like a second heart, and I put my open palm flat on the armored glass of pen 9, and the eye was already there, brass coin, thin pupil, waiting on me the way it had waited over Dremic, with that patience that is the thread entire. Easy now, I whispered, and turned the key. The double bulkhead of Pen 9 was built to open in stages, an inner gate and an outer gate with a handler's gap between, and the engineers who designed it never imagined both standing wide at once, because no sane keeper would ever turn the key twice. I turned it twice. The inner gate was already off its track. He'd seen to that himself in those 9 days of patient work, and he'd let nobody know it but me, and I'd told nobody but the wall. What came out of Pen 9 came out low and silent, and that's the detail every account agrees on, and no account manages to make real the silence. 400 pounds of war-bred Vesca crossing a steel deck makes no more sound than a door swinging, and the Skither boarding party had arranged themselves to face a crated animal being called sweetly to a rig, and what they got instead was the dark at the end of the deck standing up and coming through them like a tide through a fence. I was already down. That was the agreement my body had made without consulting me, palm on the glass, key turned, knees to the deck plates, head low, because the first law of standing next to a thing like that when it moves is, don't be a shape it has to solve. He went over me. I felt the heat of his belly pass across my back and the wind of him, and one forepaw set itself down beside my hand so precisely that the claws bracketed my fingers without touching them, and then he was beyond me and the screaming started. I won't inventory it. Not because I can't. Because the ones who died on my deck that watch had stood in rows of families pulling lockets off necks, and had shot a peace-bonded man through the shoulder for the sound of it, and had priced a cub's trust by the pound, and even so I find I don't want their ending turned into theater. Here is what the inquiry record says, in the flat hand of Marshal Hesk, and the record is enough. The boarding element on the live deck numbered 9. Contact with the released animal lasted, by the deck chronometer, 41 seconds. At the end of it, 4 Skither were down and not getting up, 3 were down and screaming, and 2 were inside the cargo lock trying to seal it behind them against their own shipmates. And the animal was standing on the lock mechanism, and the lock did not close, 41 seconds. 11 days they'd watched us decelerate, and the whole arithmetic of the boarding turned over in less than a minute, because one variable on the manifest had been filed under freight when it should have been filed under crew. Resk was not on the live deck for those 41 seconds. Resk was halfway up the catwalk stairs with 2 of its officers, supervising at the comfortable distance of command, and what Resk did when the tide came through the fence was the thing its whole species procedure was built on. It reached for leverage, the nearest hostage, the smallest cost, and the nearest warm thing to Resk's claw, and that stairwell, in the dark between the emergency lights, was a 70-pound shadow that had been flowing up the rail line toward its keeper since the gate opened, and that did not believe, deep in its 100,000-year-old law, that anything in the universe outranked its duty to stand between me and the world. Resk grabbed my cub, and my cub, 11 weeks orphaned, 26 days off a destruction order, made of grief and tallow and stubbornness, did not cry out like prey. It turned in the slaver's grip and put its plates up and its claws in, and it screamed the war scream, the sheet metal sound, the one its bloodline kept for one purpose only, the sound that means packed to me here. I have tried, in the years since, to describe what that sound did to the deck, and the closest I can come is this. Everything stopped eating, hiding, bleeding, and running, all at once everywhere, and turned. The 9th came off the cargo lock and took the catwalk stairs in 2 strides that bent the handrails, and Resk of the Hollow Tooth, who had walked through 100 tame ships, looked down the stairwell into what its own hold myths had no drawer for, and did the only smart thing it did all day. It threw the cub at the monster and ran. He caught soot out of the air the way a mother cat takes a kitten, jaws like a bear trap closing soft as a glove around 70 pounds of furious cub, set it down behind him on the landing, between his own forelegs, under the arch of his own chest, in the one place on that ship no power above or below could now reach it. And then he looked up the stairs after Resk, and he made a sound I had never heard a Vesca make, not on the ranges, not in the yards, not in any record. The deckhands who were sheltered along the crate rows said afterward they felt it in the bones of their faces. It was not a roar, it was a verdict. What ended on the boarding collar of the Hollow Tooth, I did not see, because I was on my knees in the middle of my deck, holding 2 fistfuls of straw, and by the time I reached the stairs it was over. I will say only this, because the souls who saw the aftermath deserved their account honored. The Skither captain made it to the mouth of its own boarding collar, to the threshold of its own ship, to the very lip of safety and no farther, and the marshals who came running with their bonds cut found the 9th standing over what remained, not savaging, not feeding, simply standing, the way he had stood over Dremic in the wreck of the rig, patient, making the lesson long. And when Hesk's 12 came pounding down the corridor with their pieces raised and their hearts in their mouths, the war Vesca that had killed 8 handlers and 1 slaver captain looked at them over the body and stepped back off it and sat down, cleared the lane. Let the law have the room. 11 marshals stopped dead, Hesk did not. The old man walked the length of that corridor past 400 pounds of blood-wet apex with his weapon lowered, the only Veldrani on the ship who could have done it, and he stood beside the ninth, looking down at Resk. And what he said went into ship's legend before the watch changed, because the all-ship was still keyed open from the surrender order, and the whole vessel heard it. Log the time, Hess said, boarding repelled. The hollow tooth tore loose. They didn't negotiate, didn't counter, didn't even take back their dead. With their captain gone and their boarding party in pieces and something coming up the umbilicals of their nightmares, they blew the collar and burned hard for the dark. And the last we ever heard of that ship was the open band traffic of its crew arguing about command succession, fading with distance like weather leaving, which left the stoneward. Drifting, lights flickering, 400 refugees still in their hostage rows amidships, and the skither inventory men who'd been working those rows now weaponless on their knees with marshals' bonds on their wrists. Because the moment the all-ship carried Hesk's voice saying repelled, every Veldrani on that ship had moved at once, and there are only so many places 9 stranded slavers can go. And it left Provost Merton Vole, who had spent the boarding in his sealed cargo bay amidships with his 2 handlers and his exemption, and who came out of it when the lights steadied, smoothing his robes, recalibrating, already drafting the version of events in which his negotiation had saved the ship's stores and his foresight had preserved the manifest. He came out into a corridor full of refugees being helped up off their knees by marshals, and he had begun, the witnesses agree, actually begun composing condolences and invoices in the same breath when the speakers clicked, and Shipmaster Vine's voice came on, dry as ledger paper, and read the cargo right channel transcript to the entire ship, all of it, time-stamped. The strongroom codes, the exemption, the ration stores, and the item thrown in. 400 people heard the words pit-side curiosities while standing in the marks their own knees had left on the deck. They heard what their protection had cost and who had been spending it, and then they turned, all those gray-weathered faces, mothers and old men and deckhands and the 16-year-old who fed grain fowl by the open palm, and they looked at Vol and nobody touched him. And nobody spoke, and that, Tolu told me later, searching for the trade tongue words and giving up and saying it in his own language first, that is the worst thing that can happen to a Veldrani. To be seen by everyone at once, and counted, and found to weigh nothing. The seal chain of 4 trade houses never looked heavier on a chest. Vol opened his mouth and Marshal Hesk, arriving at the end of the corridor with one elderly thumb hooked in his belt, said the second thing that went into ship's legend that day. Provost, mind the deck plates. My prisoner inventory is not finished, and you are standing where I stack them. The ninth walked back to pen 9 on his own. I want that written down plainly, because it's the part people believe last, and it's the part that matters most. When the marshals had their prisoners stacked, and the medics had the shoulder-shot man stable, and the deck crews were already welding the cargo lock, Scars, the great animal, came down the catwalk stairs with soot trotting under his chin like a tug escorting a freighter, and he walked the length of the live deck through a double line of Veldrani pressed back against the crate rows, and he stepped over the wreckage of his own inner gate, and he lay down in his own straw, in the dark he knew, with a sigh that moved loose paper at the feed locker 40 feet away. He could have gone anywhere. The wall was open, and there wasn't a soul aboard who'd have raised a hand to stop him, partly out of sense and partly because the entire ship had just watched what raising a hand near his people earned. He went home and lay down. Because that's the truth about that animal, that the manuals and the manifests and the pit agents' ledgers never had a column for. He was never trying to get out. He was trying to be let in. We never shut the gates again. There was a meeting about it, of course. Veldrani have a meeting about sunrise, and Brel brought ordnance language, and Hesk brought the inquiry record, and I brought nothing at all, and in the end the entry on the manifest was amended in the quartermaster's immaculate hand. Pen 9, gates decommissioned, occupant reclassified. They argued half a watch about the classification. Freight was obscene, and nobody would say it twice. Auxiliary equipment was taken, and besides, Tolu pointed out with a straight face, the ninth did not follow the keeper. The keeper's rounds merely passed through his territory on a schedule he approved. It was the 16-year-old grain fowl girl who found the word in Old Veldrani, a herder's word from before their cities, and they wrote it in the column, and the column has never been corrected by any authority since. It translates as close as Tolu could carry it across, to the one who watches the gate from inside. The rest of the voyage to Greel Anchorage took 22 days, and the stoneward arrived crowded, scarred, hungry, and stranger than any ship that ever docked there. The relief inspectors came aboard expecting the usual cargo of empty hands and closed faces, the look every refugee ship wore, and instead they found 400 people who lined up calm at the ration points and slept whole nights, and whose children were down on the live deck at all hours, lawful as church, sitting along the crate rows in supervised ranks doing their lessons, because the camps teach you fear travels like gas. But the stoneward had learned the other thing nobody writes down. So does the opposite, whatever you call the opposite. 400 people had spent 22 days breathing the air of a ship where the most dangerous thing alive was on their side, and it had done to them exactly what it had done to the saddle stock and the cage birds and me. Plates down, appetite back. The watch officer logged it without comment, the way Brell taught everyone, but you could read the wonder between the entries. The adjudication at Greil Anchorage took 11 days, and I will compress it, because tribunals are tedious even when they're delivering justice, which is rare enough to be savored slowly. Vull arrived at the proceedings with advocates, 3 of them, paid out of accounts that the seizure order hadn't found yet, and his case was elegant. Cargo right was lawful. The transcript showed negotiation, not collusion. His freight had been endangered by an unauthorized release performed by a contractor in violation of posted ordinance, and the contractor's interference across the whole voyage had degraded the market temperament of a 40,000 measure asset. He sought damages. From me. He actually sought damages from me, a woman whose total worldly holdings at that hour were 2 changes of clothes, a folding knife, and a ration chit. Then the tribunal called its witnesses, and the elegants had a bad 11 days, the shipmaster, with the timestamps, the marshal, with the inquiry record and the boarding accounts, read slowly, in that voice with no expression in it, which I had learned was the sound of Hesk handling something too stupid or too vile to survive a normal tone. And the tribunal learned to hear it too. You could watch them learn. The medic on the shoulder shot marshal, Brell on the manifest, the stay of schedule, the folded trough, the amended columns, every entry of fence post, and Vull's advocates walked into every one of them in the dark. And Tolu, who stood up with his slate and read into the record, at the tribunal's own request and to its visible bewilderment, the full text of the open palm doctrine, including its final clause, which I had never seen, because he'd added it the night after the boarding and shown it to everyone aboard except me. The clause says, "The doctrine is not a handling technique. The doctrine is a promise. The stock learns the open hand means safety because the hand never lies. The doctrine was brought to this ship by a human, and the doctrine is the reason this crew is alive, and the doctrine cannot be sold because the first lie kills it." The tribunal asked him what he meant by that last part. Tolu looked at Vull when he answered. "The provost tried to sell the promise as a trick," he said. "Ask him how the market received it. Cargo right, it turns out, has a boundary even in trade law. And the boundary is barratry, the betrayal of the vessel from within. Selling a strongroom code is commerce with pirates, throwing in a member of the ship's company, and the tribunal ruled, in language I keep a copy of, that the keeper of the live deck was company and not cargo, whatever her species or her contract said, is trafficking. And trafficking voids a man standing all the way down. They stripped him at the dock. The seal chain of 4 trade houses came off his chest by bailiff's hands in a public hall, link by link, house by house, each one read aloud and dissolved or transferred, and the gallery was full of stoneward refugees who had come down on their ration day to watch, and they watched the way he had taught them to watch, silently, counting, finding the weight of him. The freight bond on the live cargo was declared forfeit and vested in the ship. Vull left the hall with his robes and his advocate's bills and nothing else, and the last image I have of him is the back of a slate-colored robe in a crowd that did not move out of its way, and I find, on inventory, that I feel nothing about him at all. You don't hate a broker, you just stop selling him animals. Which left one question, and the pit agents asked it within the hour, because they truly had crossed 40 days of dark to bid, and a forfeiture sale is still a sale. The tribunal's own assessors came down to the Stoneward's live deck to value the lot. Stock and handler matched. Triple for the pair. The agents were still saying that. Even then, even after everything, because some men can watch a miracle and see a margin. The assessors came down the catwalk stairs into my deck, where the gates of Pen 9 stood decommissioned and open, and the 9th rose from his straw and came out of his pen the first time strangers had ever seen him cross his own threshold, and he walked, unhurried, the full length of the live deck, past the crate rows, past the bollard, past 40 Veldrani crew who did not press back against the crates this time, but stood where they were, because they knew the sentry's rounds when they saw them, and he came to where I was standing with the assessment party, and he turned, and he sat down, beside me, facing them. His shoulder was higher than my head. Soot came out of the shadows of the crate rows the way it had been bred to, plates flat, silent, and sat on my other side, 90 pounds now and gaining, and the pilots climbed soot-like furniture and sat on top of the cub, whiskers forward, the smallest and least impressed bailiff in the galaxy. The grainfowl girl told me afterward that from the catwalk it looked like a portrait. The assessors did not come closer to take a better look. This lot, the senior assessor managed finally, is listed as transferable. The paper transfers fine, I said. I'd let the paper do the traveling, though. There was a silence with arithmetic in it. Then the senior assessor wrote something, and what she wrote ended the auction before it opened, and I know what it was because it's in the port record of Grill Anchorage to this day, the only valuation of its kind I've ever heard of. Lot withdrawn. Stock is pack-bonded to ship's company. Separation deemed destructive to asset and assessor alike. The Stoneward never made the return run. The Relief Authority bought her hull for permanent harbor at Grill Anchorage, a depot and a school ship now, and most of the 400 stayed in the orbital district, and the crew signed on to the depot roles almost to a name. There was paperwork that wanted me to go 11 different places, resettlement boards being what they are, and Hess came to find me on the live deck while I was reading it. And he stood there with his thumb in his belt, looking at the open gates of Pen 9, for a while. The depot needs a keeper, he said. The school needs an instructor. The Veldrani herd guilds are sending a delegation because somebody filed a copy of a certain doctrine with the guild library, and they have 10,000 years of questions. His jaw worked, and the old marshal looked at me sidelong, and damned if there wasn't a shine on the look. And I am told the stock refuses transfer. Out of the dark of Pen 9 came the sound I'd been hearing every round of every watch for 2 months, the long underground thunder, the sound a Vesca makes to its own pack and nothing else on earth. And Soot lifted its head off my boot and answered it. The first time the cub had ever made that sound, the young thunder and the old running together down the length of the deck until the plates hummed. I signed where the keeper signs. 11 years I'd spent on the Reach learning that the work is the same on any world that has animals on it, and 3 more decades at Grill Anchorage have only deepened the finding. They come to the school now from 40 systems, herders and handlers and wide-eyed cadets, to learn the doctrine from the humans we've brought out and the Veldrani we've trained, and on the first morning of every class I take them down to the old live deck, to the gates that don't close, and I tell them the whole of it fits in 3 sentences, and the rest is just practice. Keep your hand open. Mean it every time. And when the day comes that something the whole galaxy fears crosses its threshold to sit down at your side, facing out, don't you dare act surprised. Because it was never taming, it was recognition, and the only thing the open hand ever promised was this. Easy now, I've got the gate, sleep.